Here's a great idea for your next outing. A cruise of the L.A. Harbor on a Spirit Cruises yacht. Spirit Cruises offers everything you need to relax and enjoy your time on the water. For more information, call 310-548-8080 or visit spiritmarine.com.
Yes, sir. Now, time for another Thrashpie radio podcast where I celebrate the legendary pure rock years of Southern California's heavy metal flagship. That's KNAC-FM. Everybody knows. Little change of pace. I'm going to be sharing parts of an interview that I did pretty recently with our former program director, one of our former program directors, Gregg Steele, one of the great ones, I might add. And I have to say, I learned an awful lot, not only about Gregg, but about what was going on with the station and the ups and the downs and so forth. The reason being, I had left the station around the end of 1989, 1990, something like that. Gone to KLOS, gone to Pirate Radio, and then I was out of work for about a year due to an illness. Gregg, fortunately, saw pity and had pity and brought me back to KNAC after my time off. So this interview, like I say, was pretty revelatory for me. And I found out that, interestingly enough, Gregg's journey to KNAC, like all of us, was unique.
So here's the crazy part. I was working in San Diego, and obviously I was aware of the KNAC phenomenon by being a student of rock music and a fan of it and working in radio. You know, the irony of it all was, I was in a relationship with a woman named Pam Edwards. Pam got a job offer to be the program director in Los Angeles at KNAC, and I was, first of all, shocked that upon her first interview, she was offered the job. Not that she wasn't talented, but like they were moving so quickly. So she moved up to Los Angeles. Eventually, within about a little over a year, it was an interesting connection because Brian Schock was the first guy that I met when I was in San Diego. He was like the overnight guy at KGB where Pam and I and Brian all worked. So Brian sort of took me under his wing. When Pam moved up, and Brian hosted the metal show at KGB in San Diego, Pam moved up to Los Angeles and was thinking, well, who should I get to be my music director? Because apparently there was turnover there or something. I'm not sure exactly why she needed someone, but ultimately, I'm like, you really ought to consider Brian. She ended up hiring Brian. Brian moved up. I stayed around at KGB, and then eventually moved to Los Angeles because my relationship was not going to work with that distance. Pam, within that period of time, that year and a half or so, decided she was given an offer from Columbia to go and sort of head up a new post in music promotion on the West Coast. Before I moved to San Diego, I programmed a radio station. Granted, it was in North Dakota, and I was 23 years old. But I had enough aptitude for idiots in that universe to think that I knew what I was doing. Not that that's necessarily warranted. I just, I honestly, I was in a major blizzard snowstorm, and I decided, why do I want to live in this weather for any longer? And I took a part-time job at KGB, which back in the day, it was great. It was a swing job. So they paid me full-time to just fill in for full-timers and weekend on-air work. And it was like, well, this is the greatest job ever. But, because I'd been a programmer and because I was very drawn to the, method of creating good radio, I asked for more and asked for more and asked for more. And then Pam left. I took over her job as music director at KGB. Then Pam left KNAC. And I was like, well, shit, lightning's not going to strike twice in this same bottle, but I'm going to talk to the general manager about being the program director. And I was like, she's so, she's my girlfriend. I'm like, I'm still not going to be the guy he's going to choose. And lo and behold, he decided to hire me as the program director, Gary Price, the general manager. So I started with a company about 1991, and I want to say you were gone by then, because I want to say that Gonzo had just left Morning, because you had already been across the street. You left in 90 or 89?
Correct, like November of 1989.
So Gonzo had just been I think Gonzo replaced you in the morning show role with him and Stu, and then I believe Gonzo got let go, and then and that's about when I came in. that was the beginning of my experience at KNAC, and it was under a weird set of circumstances, thinking I would so not be the guy that they would choose just based on my, close proximity to the previous program director. But I don't know if that was comfort for Gary Price. I'm not 100% sure, but looking back on it, obviously it was a key decision in my continued growth, and it was a pivotal one in my development as a human because of the great relationships I think that I not only struck with the employees there, but the kinship of understanding how you build a bond or are included as part of the bond with the fans of a radio station. So it was an exciting time for me.
In retrospect now, I don't know that I could have said this earlier because I didn't know you. You brought an awful lot to the job. That station was entering a whole new era of competition, of music to be played, and promotions to be done in a station that was sort of in its second stage of growing up. It needed to become a big boy radio station because it was competing with some big boys. Speak to the competition and the music transition that was going on, and namely the Seattle music.
It was really, really a very difficult time musically because, when you think about KNAC, you don't think about the teeth cutting of the radio station in being instrumental with Bon Jovi and Poison. But, look back at all of those Bon Jovi videos, and it's just littered with KNAC. I mean, the amount of promotions you guys did to be part of those bands and their launches, that was, part and parcel of the development phase, not only what heavy metal was exposed to with the universe of pop, not to mention, obviously the hardcore bands, but those were bands that were embraced by KNAC because they were not embraced by others in the, radio community at that time. However, when the station had gotten from, I think when Pam came in, it was sort of the tail end of that era. And, it was now, what do we do? What do we do with this music that's kind of now lost credibility because it's now in the pop space so much? But it was tough to give that up. And there were huge records those bands were the biggest things in the universe at that time. Because we were cultish and underground and small signaled and all the other disadvantages, we couldn't be uncool by now continuing to play these bands that we had helped expose, but more now sort of grown beyond us. So, enter sort of me, and it's now, we've got these bands that are sort of fringe, getting exposure, that are kind of aggressive, but we're not sure what they are. Because if you really remember what alternative was, because many people felt, as we rolled out some of those Seattle-type bands later, I'll get into that in a second, they were deemed by some as alternative records, but alternative at the time was very dance-oriented, very Depeche Mode, and very Cure, and very synth-oriented. They were more about the keyboard than they were about the guitar, and obviously the grunge music from Seattle had a lot more in common with guitar. So when you saw what was starting to happen around the late 80s, with Jane's Addiction, and the influence that some of the bands that we were playing that were now citing other punk rock-styled bands or aggressive rock music bands, we had to sort of address, well, where are we going to go? Are we going to stay on this pop rock path and play the next power ballad from Poison? Or are we going to, embrace musically not only what we've continued to always do, which was, bands like Anthrax and bands like Armored Saint and, harder core bands, but really we had to still, and remember also Metallica was starting to turn into a pop entity at this time, or was just about to. We were sort of faced with, well, where do we go with this music? And just prior to me getting there, the decision was made to play Alice in Chains, and they were a Seattle grunge-ish rock band that drew tons of influence from Black Sabbath, which was a seminal rock band, obviously with Ozzy and the rest. It ultimately became a decision like, well, if we're going to play Alice in Chains, we can play some Jane's Addiction and not catch a lot of flack because alternative radio is not playing them anyway. Well, why don't we sort of dip our toe in the water and figure out what these Nirvana-y Pearl Jam bands are, but we have to decide we're going to do it, and we're going to do it early. We can't do it after KROQ decides to play it or another alternative entity decides to embrace it. And we had to jump in full feet or lose an opportunity. And whether it was the right move or the wrong move, it was something that we had to do. musically. And on top of that, if you recall, at the same time, you were at KLOS at the time, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm. Or Pirate.
And Pirate, had been an aggressive, very hair band feeling, but more pop than rock music station. Rock was still popular, and so the rock music that they played also got a lot of pop airplay. But about the time that the switch happened when Pam left and I came in was when Kerry Kurlop, who was the programmer of KLOS, who I believe you worked for, and then you went over to Pirate with him, or am I wrong?
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay, so at that time it was like, well, now we know that Pirate's going to probably start being more of a rock station. Obviously, that'll have impact against KLOS, but, who's going to own the hard rock music? And we can't be out-owned by anything, or we're just going to be the small watt pea shooter with only the unpopular music being played. Mm-hmm. So we had to sort of take a position that was like, if K-Rock's not playing this, we got to get on it before Pirate does, and continue to do bigger-than-life promotions and continue to be louder and more aggressive in your face, and just say we're owning this position and not be afraid of being the one who sets the trends like we did with the hairband music and the hard rock music and the heavy metal music and everything else. It was like we're going to have to be at the forefront of it. So those are things that sort of came down the pike when I was there. And, again, in hindsight, it's difficult to say whether it was the right or wrong decision, but it was a decision that was made, and we had to embrace it wholeheartedly.
Well, I've talked to a number of people, Greg, and I think so myself, that at that time, in that particular transition, you were the right guy to lead that little station through that period. I don't know that Tom Marshall could have done that. Pam was gone. Jimmy Christopher certainly couldn't have done that.
But the good thing, too, is that Brian Schock was still there. Brian, was there part of the transition. He was the music director under Pam, and he stayed as music director under me, and then eventually he went to take his own program director job. But that was really, really helpful because we had a lot of familiarity with each other, and we could have some pretty frank and honest conversations about, like, what should we be doing with this.
Right. And, I think when you talked about being somewhat surprised that Gary would hire you, knowing that you came from KGB and Brian and Pam and blah, 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 that's probably what he understood, that there was a working relationship there already with you, with the three of you, and that helps, because it's real hard to change management people when you have sub managers, that might just want to create a stink. I mean,
No, you're totally right, and I guess I never really thought about it till this conversation. But the other thing to really consider is that shortly after Jimmy Christopher, who was greatly influenced by the encouragement from Gary Price, but shortly after the change of formats, Jimmy Christopher was gone, and then Tom Marshall. Tom had to carry the brunt of what that radio station ultimately became. I mean, I think there are things that Jimmy put on the air that were the right things at the time, but like when the radio station finally learned how to walk, it was Tom that had to teach it how to go from just walking to rocking, and I think that he did an exceptional job there. But there was a lot of turnover because Tom left a couple years in, and then Pam left a couple years in. So it was like, where are we with this competitive landscape? Not only is the music starting to change, we set some trends as a radio station prior to me. Now the landscape, the competitive landscape is changing too. So I think maybe you're right. Maybe he opted for a little bit closer to continuity based on the relationships than picking a wild card that could have been maybe more disastrous. I don't know. We didn't have huge successes. When the radio station never really had huge rating successes ever. But all of our successes were found on the street. Our successes were because we had fans that would fight for us, not because the ratings gods necessarily looked favor upon our crappy signal. It was really just what we did that resonated with fans, and the fans are the ones. Anyone that is listening now that actually was a fan of KNAC in the day, I think they clearly were the reason that we ever had successes. It had nothing to do with what we as broadcasters think is like, well, our numbers were X and Y and Z.
Yeah, right.
No, you know what? We were never a radio station like that. So it was whatever wins we had, it was because we could feel it emanating from the people that listened.
That last statement is quite telling, and it says a tremendous amount about Gregg Steele as a person. I cannot tell you how many radio people I've worked for, and I think I worked at 12 or 13 different radio stations. The program director would swear to you that everything that happened good on that station was his or her idea, and that they need to be paid a boatload of money for that, and that anybody that doesn't believe that is fired right now. So that's quite a telling statement right there. Our success was due entirely to the loyal fans of that radio station. Absolutely spot on. And I might add, that loyalty lives on today. Well, I have more insight coming up from Gregg Steele's interview in this series of Thrashpie radio podcasts. Your comments and correspondence of any kind, always welcome at thrashpieradio@gmail.com. Give us a like and a share. Keep your eye on your Facebook page for the next Thrashpie radio podcast.